Oh, hello, hi. My name is Caroline Bull, as already said, and thank you for listening to me today. I've got a lot of things to go through, so some of it is going to seem a little bit rushed, but I thought wanted to just do a snapshot, really, of the kind of training that we do. I started off by just talking a little bit about my role as a specialist midwife. We know how huge an issue this is. I think statistics came out just today that 3.8 million people are subject to domestic abuse in the UK. And we know that a woman is killed every 3 days in the UK as well. But I think what I wanted to focus on today is going straight into something that we call the homicide timeline. And the reason I'm going to do this is because Judith is going to talk later on about the experience of the baby and thinking about how the baby is subject to abuse. But I wanted to focus on the woman's experience here today. And the most important thing that I found when this research was published back in 2019 is for the first time there was research that actually matched the lived experience of the women that I was supporting on my caseload. It's an incredibly important piece of research, but we use it all the time in our office for assessing risk, but also it really helps understanding how domestic abuse is not an isolated incident. It's not the red mist coming down and somebody suddenly losing their temper. It's all about power and control, and it is a pattern of behaviors. So what I'm going to do is actually go through this within the context of pregnancy. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these stages. Now, the vast majority of cases do not end up in homicide. However, many of these highly abusive perpetrators do is follow the early stages of this timeline. So just starting off, if we imagine at a booking appointment, for example, we might know that that the partner or ex-partner or anyone has a pre-relationship history of being a perpetrator of abuse. Now, this can mean involvement with the police, but it can also just be something that they sometimes give themselves away. So this is when we hear, and community midwives will be aware of this one, where they hear the ex-partner described as crazy, that the ex-partner makes up lies about them. It might also be that they have children that they don't see. Why don't they see those children? And this is the point where we know that this is a really big risk factor for moving on to becoming an abusive relationship. The second stage in the timeline is the way that the relationship escalates really, really quickly. And I see this a lot in my caseload. So what happens is somebody meets somebody else, the relationship goes very, very, very fast. So probably the best description I have of this is they met New Year's Eve, moved in New Year's Day. She was pregnant by February. So what happens is a very, very intense early stages, early declarations of love, moving in very quickly, very early pregnancy, like I say. And what is happening here is that the perpetrator is looking for commitment, because once there is a commitment to this relationship, they then feel entitled to maintain control of that person. So we've then got a relationship which is dominated by coercive control. And I think it's really important to understand that there may be no violence. There may be no violence until a homicide. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the relationship is dominated by coercive control. And we'll talk a little bit more about those tactics in a bit. You've got this relationship, lots of coercive and controlling behaviors. The woman's world is becoming smaller and smaller because her whole world, in a way, is expected to rotate around this perpetrator. What happens then is you have a trigger. Now, this is a trigger where this can be anything. The most dangerous trigger is separation, when the woman or mum attempts to leave the relationship, but it can be all sorts of other things. Pregnancy can be a trigger. However, we have to understand that pregnancy may not be a trigger as well. And I get really frustrated when I say that DA starts in pregnancy. I don't believe it does. I think there is already an abusive relationship, and pregnancy is a trigger. So but as I say, sometimes perpetrators will keep women pregnant over multiple pregnancies, because of course, pregnancy in itself can reduce economic independence, can make someone more emotionally dependent on them, makes it harder to get away. So you've got this trigger, but just to be clear, it might also just be putting the soup back in the wrong place in the cupboard. Okay. What happens to this trigger is the perpetrator's sense of control is challenged. So there is an escalation of tactics. Now, these tactics can really vary. They might include violence, they might include silent treatment. I know from women on my caseload, the silent treatment sometimes is almost the most painful for them, really hard. Perpetrators will completely ignore them for days and days and days or weeks on end. Um, this escalation, the sole purpose of this escalation is to get power back. Okay. Now, in pregnancy, like I said, you might see this escalate in the pregnancy, but where we know the really key time for escalation is actually in the postnatal period, because a new baby, and I'm sure Judith will talk about this, can be very threatening to a perpetrator's sense of control. Babies are very difficult to control. They cry, they need their mother. There's a very sort of relationship that they might find threatening to them. And I think one of the things that you will often see, and we'll talk about this, is the undermining of that relationship between mother and baby in the postnatal period. So I know I had an example where a woman, she was not allowed to see or pick up her baby when they cried. And for a whole week, she was not allowed to go anywhere near the baby. The baby just cried and cried and cried. And when this woman finally did get into refuge, she didn't put that baby down because she had not been allowed to go to her baby. And I think how hard that must be for her. He didn't want that. He had complete control over her, and she did not feel that she could do that. So you've got this escalation, and actually, a lot of the time, it works. It's really successful. The woman understands that when these things happen, the tactics escalate. So you go back to stage 3 with the relationship dominated by coercive control. And what you have is a cycle where you're going around 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, round and round and round and round and round. However, what sometimes then happens is you get to side 6. Just to say, back in 5, one of the things you might also find is that the perpetrator actually leaves the relationship. They've lost control. They actually decide, you know what, I'm going out of this relationship, which then brings them back to 1. Okay, so your first stage. But also it means that we see them again. So I've been in this job for 5 years now, and we see the same perpetrators coming through again and again and again with new partners. And that is because they are following this cycle. Okay. So we then get to 6, which is a change in thinking. And this is where what the perpetrator does, they're less interested in getting the relationship back and more about punishment at this point. And this is where you sometimes see that they'll take them through the family courts, often will use the children as a way of punishing the mother. There might be calls to social services or threats to social services. I should say, back in escalation, threats to refer to children's services and baby being taken away are a very common tactic of perpetrators throughout pregnancy. It's a really effective way of maintaining control. If you tell anybody, they will take your baby away. And that's an incredibly frightening thing to have told to you. So we've got this change of thinking. And this is the point where, as I say, they choose to punish. And in the worst case scenarios, they then decide that they are going to kill their partner. And when they do, they plan it. I think Professor Monckton Smith had one where he planned it for 5 years. They look it up, they do Google searches, they really, really plan it meticulously. And then at the end, there is the homicide. So we don't, this happens. Women are, we know they are murdered, as I say, every week. But as I say, for most of us and for the pregnancy, we see this point in the middle here, just going round and round and round. And this is why when we think about routine inquiry, it's really important to understand that risk is not static. So at one point in the relation, if you are doing routine inquiry, for example, when you're in that relationship in stage 3, she might not tell you at that point, But if you're in escalation in stage 5, she might be really frightened and she might actually feel that she wants help at that point. So I so often get asked, why do you ask about routine? Why do you do routine inquiry all the way through pregnancy? Can't we just ask once, you know? And my response to that is we would never ask about fetal movements just once. We wouldn't ask about fetal movements at the beginning and go, that's great, lovely. We're not going to ask about that again. In my mind, this is the same. Risk is a constantly changing thing, and we have to be aware to ask when it's safe to do so throughout the pregnancy and in the postnatal period, and understand those triggers and those escalation patterns. And that will help us understand the risks to the women that we are supporting. So that's a very quick version of this. I do recommend anyone to read her research. That was a very quick run through of her, but it's very, very helpful. So here I just wanted to look a little bit in more detail about those tactics. Okay, so we do talk about them as tactics, and that is because they will use sometimes a scattershot approach to various different kinds of tactics, whatever works. And sometimes what works to get back control is being really loving. And I know I had one woman who told me that, you know, one day he'd be lovely and the next day nasty. And it was this constant going between lovely and nasty. And these are attempts to pull her back. But we know that there are lots of different tactics. So we know isolation is a key tactic. And of course, pregnancy is an opportunity in a way to disrupt that tactic because the woman is starting to come and see health professionals. She will see and encounter more health professionals through her pregnancy. She may not have been to a GP for years, but will start seeing them. So we can help with that. Gaslighting, that's that way, make people question their sanity. Silent treatment, as I say, threats of suicide. Now, Monkton Smith says we should always take when the perpetrator is threatening suicide very seriously, because it could be that they are at the point where they're thinking they're going to kill themselves, but they might also kill their partner. So we need to take those threats of suicide seriously. But I have to say, it's such a common tactic. It's probably one of the most common tactics that I see on a daily basis with women in my care. They threaten suicide, and it's very, very effective. Women often, in my experience, they may have separated. He threatens suicide, they go back because they're terrified of that. So threats of violence, as I say, harm, punish, or frighten. Non-fatal strangulation, any kind of airway suppression, we have to take very, very seriously. That increases the risk of homicide by 8 times. Undermining motherhood, harm to children or pets, love bombing, as I say, jealousy is a key factor. So there are lots of different tactics, and as I say, they will often use different ones to kind of whatever is most effective for them. I can't see any time, so bear with me. Okay. So this brings me to the work that's being done on domestic abuse, and I've just put Kat Backer is doing a lot of work in this area, and to me, that is such a clear statement. Domestic abuse is common. This is not unusual. This is happening to the women in our care every day. We are more likely, and I'm here in the hospital now, to have women upstairs who are subject to abuse than have experiencing gestational diabetes. It is hugely widespread, and unfortunately, we are not very good at spotting this and supporting women. We know in Embrace report, 22% of the women were subject to DA, either prior to or during pregnancy, and there were 14 homicides. But in a lot of the work that Kat Backer has done in this area, they found that unfortunately in the case reports, in Embrace reports, domestic abuse was known about, but the midwives did very little about it. And to me, that was hugely shocking, because I think I'd always thought in a way it was because we didn't know. We can't help what we don't know about. But what we found in the Embrace reports was that actually midwives did know it was there, but they often didn't do the appropriate signposting. They weren't doing routine inquiry, and they were doing things like saying, oh, okay, so you're subject to domestic abuse, we'll refer you to mental health support. Which is great because she may well need mental health support, but it's kind of misunderstanding the cause of her anxiety and suffering if you're doing a referral to mental health and putting her on antidepressants, for example. So it is really important that we as midwives and student midwives understand we have to do this. This is a very scary statistic. 62 women were killed by a current or former partner. More women were killed by their sons than by a stranger. Now, if you believed all the news, you would think it was very dangerous out there, but actually, women are most at risk in their home. Okay. And I think this last point as well is that we often in the notes, what you see is a lack of information about the partner. Sometimes their name isn't even put down. I cannot tell you how important it is to understand the role of the perpetrator in this. We need to focus on them, and that's why the timeline is so good. We can't be looking at the woman and blaming her. And there's a lot, unfortunately, we did see a lot of victim blaming language, sort of inability to maintain personal boundaries. As you know, this is her fault that this is happening to her. And we really do need to not do that if we possibly can. I'm aware I haven't got much time, but routine inquiry, please ask. Routine inquiry, routine part of good clinical practice, even when there are no indicators of such abuse. So we should be doing it at every opportunity when it is safe to do so. And when, if there is disclosure, we should be referring appropriately to specialist advocacy support, MARAC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference. Clare's Law, has he got a prehistory as a perpetrator? We can do Clare's Law. But routine inquiry is probably the most powerful tool that we have in the box, that we should be doing that whenever, as I say, it's safe to do so. I just wanted to finish quickly. This is the dash. I'll miss that for now. One of the things that there's more work being done about now is suicide and domestic abuse related suicides. And this is a huge area that I think really only beginning to be understood. Suicide is the leading cause of death in domestic abuse cases, and suicide obviously is hugely significant in embrace and maternal deaths. They are not separate issues. We need to be looking at how domestic abuse impacts women's lives on a daily basis and understanding how that leads to suicide. And I'm just going to finish quickly because I'm aware I haven't got much time. With Professor Jane Monckton-Smith also has done a timeline towards suicide. And I think what's important here is you can see it's quite similar to the original one, but what we do have is that women do who end up taking their lives, is there is often a disclosure. They do tell somebody, and then they actually look for help. But when they don't get that, or when that help is not there, they then feel that complete sense of hopelessness and entrapment that happens within an abusive relationship. And then suicide feels like the only option way out. So again, this is where midwives have such an important role, understanding that women who are subject to DA, it has a hugely detrimental impact on their mental health and can, in the worst case scenario, lead to suicide. So we have to think of all these things at the same time and not just put domestic abuse in a box by itself over in the corner in the safeguarding box. It goes all the way through everything we do, every single aspect of the care that you give. You need to be thinking, is this woman subject to abuse, and is that impacting her care and her relationship with her baby? So yeah, I think I'm done, am I, Sue?